So in our preparation for today, of course, we have talked in the organizing committee about what is there really to celebrate. And of course, looking from here towards you, it's clear there's a lot to celebrate. But also there's a pending question. Is there anything good about a PhD after all? So I have my answer to that question. But when you have deep questions like that, often it's a good idea, good opportunity to invite people from outside and come and give us an answer. So that's what we have done today. We have invited Lone Frank, who's standing here. Let me just introduce Lone. So Lone has a PhD in neurobiology and a background in research. She is a distinguished science writer. She's an acclaimed author and a science journalist, and writes not every week, but often for Weekendavisen, right? Yeah. She's a well-known voice in the public debate about science, technology, and society, and she's known for also strong opinions about the interplay between these different things. Lone has written several books, 5 books. She's been writing for some of the best international journals that we have. She's made the documentary Genetic Me, and she has co-produced a TV series about controversial science. So please join me in welcoming Lone to the podium here. So is there anything good about a PhD?
Well, the very short answer is yes, but I'll try to elaborate a little on that. But first, thank you so much for the invitation. I was really happy when I was told I was going to speak to PhD students, because it made me think about getting a PhD and how awful it was, and also how central it has been for everything I have done ever since that PhD, and my thinking about a lot of things in life. So I'll start talking a little bit about that. And thinking about my own PhD, it goes back to the early 90s. And I can tell you I was definitely not building any cathedrals. It was 3 years. I was in the US. I was working at a biotech company. I came from the University of Copenhagen. I had done a master's, and I thought I was, so great. I was this neuroscience up-and-coming person, and I got to the US to this company, and they gave me a little bit of lab space, and I was supposed to do something that I'd never done before, which was grow cells in culture. I had no idea about how to do this. So I was basically told, well, every Monday, you will get a rat. It's a pregnant rat. You will kill it. You will take out the fetuses. You will take out the brains of the fetuses. You will dissect out the hippocampus. You will sow the cells out in cell culture, and you will do these experiments with various neurotrophic growth factors. And I had this whole project, and it was all lined up, and it was just about doing it. And I had no idea about how to do any of this. And since I came from Copenhagen University with lots of technicians to help you, and then I was standing there in the middle of nowhere with absolutely no help. So it was just about, getting used to killing these rats, taking their fetuses, growing the cells every Monday, doing the same thing over and over and over. And it took a year before it even worked with the cell culture and the experiments and stuff. And then there were another 2 years of hell, of doing other experiments with these cells, and finally getting the whole thing together in papers, sending them out, and so forth. And along the way, I felt completely alone among all these people who were experts at their jobs and had no time to help me. And I remember sitting with my supervisor at some point, complaining about, why wasn't it like back in Copenhagen where it was all cozy and, technicians and coffee and, and he said, well, I can be your supervisor here. I cannot be your psychotherapist. Forget about it. And so I made it without a psychotherapist. And I have to say, it was 3 really, really tough years. But I figured out something. It taught me something that has, been, I think, it was sort of formative for my character in some way. I came from this privileged background, Copenhagen University, and I learned for the first time in my life to, be absolutely on your own and work, really. Sit down on your ass and work when there's a problem that you have to solve. You can't run to somebody and say, it's really difficult, and I have to go out and do something else this weekend, and da-da-da. No, you have to sit down and be able to really work through things and push through things when you think that everything is gonna go to hell and you're never getting this PhD, and everything is totally awful. And so that lesson, and the lesson of being able to really think for yourself. I mean, you have a project. It's something that nobody knows how to solve. Nobody knows what the results are going to be and what they're going to mean for the field and so forth. And you are there alone to figure out what it is you're doing. Is it well controlled? What is it going to mean? What does it mean when these cells behave, strangely, and nobody can tell you why? These lessons have been, I think, at the bottom of everything I've done since. Don't give up on the work, just do the work and think, always think critically. And it's easy to say that critical thinking, that's something we have in Danish culture, it's something we learn in school, blah, blah, blah. No, really, really critical thinking where you ask tough questions even of yourself, and you doubt everything, basically, to try to figure out the solution to problems. That's something you really internalize when you do a PhD, because it's a tough time. It's where you really learn it. And it's something that stays with you forever, and it's something that can be used in every field of life. So when people today ask me, and a lot of people ask me this, isn't it a terrible waste that you went through a whole PhD and now you're just a journalist? And I always say, no, it was not exactly a waste, because it basically taught me everything that I base my work on now. I mean, I couldn't be as critical in what I do now if I didn't have a PhD, if I hadn't gone through that work. What I also found out, and this is where I will get into something quite different, is that science was just not for me. I'm sure most of you here will go on and do great things in science. Maybe there are a few that are thinking, maybe it's not for me, maybe, let's see, I'll get this PhD and then I might do something else. What I figured out was that science, the way that science really interests me, is not in doing the actual experiments. It's not in sitting there with one tiny or not so tiny problem and trying to lay brick by brick. It's actually you could call it the bigger perspective. What really got me going was always thinking about what are the perspectives in this, and how does my field connect to some other field over there and something quite different over there. So sitting around in the lab with the cells growing, thinking about this stuff got me to realize I have to go out and do something different. So I had a job lined up at a biotech company, and at the last minute I called them and said, I can't do this, I'll ruin my life, I'll have to do something else. So probably good for the biotech company, and definitely good for me. Because what I thought, well, where is it that I can go and think about the perspectives of science? I could only really see one area, and that was, go in and talk about science, go and write about science. And at the time, of course, in the 90s, it was not like today, where science communication is everywhere. I mean, just look at the PR department of DTU. I mean, there are hundreds of people here who are just working with communication of science. Same in every newspaper. Everywhere, science communication. It's on the agenda, and it has been for years and years. It wasn't back then. But I sort of got into it by going to editors at newspapers and saying, well, have you thought about, it's not just that, you probably look at science like many people do, that it's this very specific activity, it's sort of on its own out there in the corner. And what it does is it gets us new medicines, it gets us new, telephones, apps, artificial intelligence, whatever. But what I really think is so interesting about science, the most interesting thing, is how it affects our culture, how it affects the way that we think about everything. So the knowledge that comes from science really is not just about gadgets, it's about how we think and how our culture works and how our society works. So those, very big pictures and those perspectives have always been what I wanted to, think about, reflect on, write about. And that's what I've basically been doing. And I think where we see it very clearly, and where, everybody can probably see it when you point it out, that this effect on culture is, if you look at what we call scientific revolutions or scientific great leaps, look at how Copernicus, his worldview, basically, threw over the way of thinking that came before. So when you go from thinking of the world is in this, the Earth is in the center of the world, to no, the Earth is actually just one little planet centering around a sun, and there are other suns out there, that gives you a completely different perspective on the world and your role in it. You could point to Darwin, which is a revolution that is not even over. I mean, it's not everyone in the world. There's probably more people who believe in some kind of creation than people who recognize that evolution is a phenomenon that goes on. So this is a revolution that isn't over. And it took man, or humanity, out of the center and said, we're nothing special. We're this one species out of tons of species, and there's nothing inherently great about us. We just have these characteristics, and they have evolved under certain conditions and so forth. And so we were not anymore that very special species that we used to be. That changed the thinking a whole lot. It changed the perspective on our role in the world. And we're living through really, really, really interesting times and interesting scientific leaps today. I mean, two things that I would point to that I don't know how much you know about here, since you're all computer people, is you could talk about neuroscience, a neuroscience revolution. You could talk about a genetics revolution that we have seen being rolled out, in fact. Because if you talk about neuroscience, the revolution there is really that modern neuroscience went from just looking at diseases of the nervous system and trying to figure out what is Parkinson's, what is Alzheimer's, to the most interesting questions are really what is human nature? What aspects of human nature, how do we explain them in neurological or neuroscientific terms? Where does love reside? Where does, where do feelings reside? What do they actually mean? How do they express themselves? Where does behavior come from? All that stuff. And so what we've seen over, let's say, 20 years is basically that neuroscience has killed off the soul. Nietzsche killed God. That was good. It was a good start. And then neuroscience came along and killed off the soul. Because where we used to think of souls or psyches or something kind of immaterial that was not just reducible to what is in the brain or our physiology, that's not really the sort of broad reality anymore. People have sort of realized that we are, each of us, we are our brains. Everything that is human, every aspect of human nature is really something that you can look at in the brain. That's where it's expressed. The psyche, whatever that used to be, is really the brain working. And so that is changing a whole lot, the perspective and the way of just looking at yourself. We have gone from, again, when I started out as a journalist, everyone, when they thought about neuroethics and the ethics around enhancing anything having to do with the brain, for example. Could you take medicine to, enhance your cognition, enhance your memory, enhance anything? That was by, every ethicist on the earth basically seen as a no-no. Of course you couldn't. That would be completely off, completely unacceptable. I mean, you could mess around with activity in the brain that was, diseased or having to do with illnesses or abnormalities, but you could not take, a well human being and enhance some kind of cognition or emotional aspect. That would be unethical. And then slowly, all this started to turn around as it became just more and more clear that, well, if each of us is our brain, and each of us really, we don't have a essential self. I mean, in the brain, there is no little essential self in there that's, we used to call it, used to talk about the real me. I have to find myself. No, you have to find out who you want to be. Because of course you have a neurological starting point, but you do not exist. The existence of a essential self is simply an illusion of the brain. If you change the state of your brain, you are different. There is another you in there. And that realization has made it absolutely acceptable and normal to start messing around with your brain and your neurology. I mean, if there's something that we don't like being depressed, or we don't like being hyperactive, or something else we don't like, well, we go to a doctor and say, can you do something about this? And even if it's not a disease or a diagnosis, well, how many people try to change their brains by doing meditation or mindfulness or something like that? It's all about changing your brain because you want to change who you are. And that has become the normal state of things. And if you read bioethicists today, they will talk about, of course, it's absolutely acceptable. There's nothing unethical about this. It's just about how we deal with inequality in the access to these technologies in the future. So it's become a totally different question. And that is because scientists have looked at the brain and looked at what are emotions, what is cognition, and really begun to understand it in neurological terms. You can say the same thing about genetics. What happens when genetics becomes something quite new? And it has. Within the last 10 years, we've had a transition from purely academic genetics. It was just something for people in labs, fiddling about with single genes or a couple of genes. Suddenly we have the technology to sequence whole genomes in no time and for basically very cheaply. So suddenly we have personal genomics, which is, I think, biology's parallel to the computer revolution, really. Suddenly we can all get our hands on genetic information, our own genetic information, maybe that of our kids, maybe that of, if somebody forgets a cup, you could take it and actually swab their DNA and get it sequenced, and and from really starting to understand how we become the people we become because of our genetics and, of course, our environment, but understanding where the inheritance comes from, what it means, what genes mean for how the brain develops, for example, for who we are, and of course for how we look and our diseases and all that stuff. I mean, it gives us a whole different handle on understanding ourselves, and in a way it tells us, together with the neurorevolution, that humans are, yes, we know we are animals, we know we are biological beings, but we are more and more becoming an understandable organism that we can, in fact, I wouldn't say reverse engineer, but you can certainly understand the human organism in kind of mechanical engineering terms, and that again, that changes the view of who we are. It changes the view of, so what could we perhaps become? What could we perhaps do to humans? So it opens up a whole slew of questions and a debate about, can we engineer humans in the future? Should we engineer humans in the future? And it still sounds spooky to most of us. And like, no, we say evolution is wiser than we are. Maybe we should just, stay out of that. We shouldn't ever engineer human beings. But let me tell you, I will predict China will be first. And there will be engineering of human beings in some ways, whether it be, adding resistance genes to certain diseases or illnesses, or removing, genes that have to do with a brain development you don't really want, or whatever it is. There will be human engineering, I'm pretty sure. And again, that comes from having the knowledge. And I would say that you guys who work with computers, who work with AI, who work with big data and data analysis, I mean, you are the guys who hold the future in your hands. I mean, when we think about what are the upcoming scientific revolutions, they're really moving from the physical space, from having to do with actual people and organisms, to the immaterial space, where the next great leaps and developments are coming from. Well, that's of course the cyber world. It's the world of data. It's the world of algorithms. Most of us out there don't have a clue. I mean, we have no idea where it is we're going. We are starting to, of course, it's clear to everyone. And again, it's so interesting to see how it's become clear over a very short time. We have been using social media. We have known about big data and data collection and use of data and da-da-da for a while, but it's sort of been something not very important or something esoteric, and suddenly, because of these scandals that we all heard about, it becomes very, very clear. This is changing our world. It's changing the way we interact. It's changing all our notions about what is privacy, what can we expect to have for ourselves, what do we have, what do we have to give in terms of data to get what we want from, say, the healthcare system or the media or financial systems. That whole exchange of the data and thinking about how our data, our behavioral data that isn't our physical body, but it's just as integral a part of us as our physical bodies. Where does that data go? Who owns it? Who shouldn't have their hands on it? All that stuff is really up in the air, and things that we should be debating much more than we are, and we should be debating it in much clearer terms. When I think about what's going on in Denmark right now, there are plans for making this national genome database where people who come in contact with the healthcare system and who are offered a sequencing of their genome because that's a way to get them the best possible treatment for cancer or some kind of other disease, whatever it is. Then they're asked, could we please, put your DNA sequence in our database? That notion has become, for many, many people, and in no time, and because of a little group of doctors who are adamantly against this and who are very vocal in the media, this idea has become to a lot of people absolutely horrifying. And I'm thinking, guys, this is the wrong thing that you're debating. This is a database of some data that relates directly to your physical body, your possibilities of getting the best care, our possibility to develop our healthcare system, to create new kinds of medication and treatments and so on and so forth. And this is what you're afraid of. And it's a database that would be controlled by the state that you actually have a lot of trust in. When people are asked, do you trust the government? And yeah, we pretty much trust the government in Denmark. So this is not what you should be afraid of, because at the same time, you're sitting there at your PC, at your iPad, with your phone, you are giving away data that says so much more about you than your genome does to Mark Zuckerberg and other people like that. And this is what people should be discussing. And that whole debate and the whole issue of where are we going in this new, brave new data world? Where are we going with artificial intelligence? What can it become? How can it impact the way we live, the way we think about ourselves in relation to machines? I see a whole slew of questions coming out of that and really interesting discussions. And I'm sitting on the outside and I'm thinking all the time, there should be so many more scientists or people who are experts on this that will not only, create their, build their cathedrals, lay their bricks, but also go out there and tell the rest of us what is going on, what is it you're building, and reflect on what are the larger consequences of what you're building, and what are the larger consequences and perspectives of the way that things could be used. So go out there and be part of the debate. And also, if we return a little bit to the communication of science, the communication of science should not be about 100 PR people trying to come up with little notes for people like me. Could you go and interview this researcher because DTU would like to have, a little notice here and there in the media. No, it's about you people going out there and communicating, not just to journalists. Of course, that's nice. When you give interviews, it's nice. When you go on TV and radio. But think about the possibilities that you have for going on all kinds of media on your own and start, having a dialogue with the world. You're in the middle of this whole technological explosion. And you are really, you should think about this, you are not just laying your own bricks, you are shaping and creating the future that is going to be really, really driven by what is happening in the cyber world, the data world, the AI world. People like me are already, too old. We won't matter in this. But I really, really hope that, in a few years, I will be hearing voices from people like you, not just in my articles or radio programs, but on all kinds of platforms that we don't even imagine right now. So with that, I think I will leave you with hopefully the feeling that, yes, there's something great about a PhD. There's something great about being the people who create the future. But there's also, and that's the other point, the other side of the coin, there's also great, great responsibility. And yeah, I hope you will all take that up. And if it's awful to be doing a PhD, just work through it. It's going to be great on the other side. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lone. So we do have time for questions or remarks, comments.
Sure.
If anyone dare.
Anything.
So is it still like that being a PhD student?
Thank you, Lorna. That was really inspiring and interesting. I work myself with doing training courses for PhDs, and I often wonder about the relevance of a PhD education in the future. We often talk about education experts, they talk about education's all about preparing people for the future, but we don't know what the future's going to be. But you've indicated yourself that in the future, computers are going to be, and algorithms and artificial intelligence, they're going to be better than we are. So what about that future that some people talk about where the computers are going to be doing better research than us? What are your thoughts on what the future PhD education should be like in 50 or 100 years' time?
Good question. I'm so glad I'm not here in 100 years. But I think when we talk about AI and we talk about computer intelligence that's going to take over everything, and certainly it's going to take over my job before it takes over your job. I always think that leaves a lot for human beings. It leaves a lot of, you might say again, critical thinking. You know, thinking about basically asking questions of the world and the way things work. And I'm not sure that it will ever be relevant in the same way what questions a machine asks. Or if a machine asks relevant questions, you will have to have humans that are able to evaluate. Is that a question that we should, as humans, try to answer, or should we just, let it lie? I'm not sure that. I think a PhD should always be. It should always be, where you are actually taught to be an intellectual Swiss knife, in a way. It's not that you can. There isn't anything you can point to at a certain point in time saying, oh, this is a skill that you should now definitely learn during your PhD because that's going to be useful when this happens in 5 years. Nobody knows. But learning to really be versatile and to be able to, change and follow what's going on in the world and take clues from that and think about it and not just. Again, as I said before, it's really about you being able to think critically and reflect and make synthesis from what you see happening. It's so valuable when you talk about, for example, a PhD. It's so valuable to be able to, even if you have like me a PhD in some kind of ancient biology. You can really, what you have learned is that you can go out there and apply principles to whatever field you want to look at. You can go out and collect knowledge, and you know about how to evaluate that knowledge, how to figure out what you can use, what you can't use, what is trustworthy, what is not. All that depends on being able to really think critically. So that is the central thing, and it's something you can't learn from a book. You have to have real life problems that you solve and that you fail at and you come back and then you solve it from there. And I don't think in that way a PhD in 100 years will be very much different from what it is today.
All right, more questions, comments?
Hi, I was just wondering, what are your thoughts about biometric data? What I'm hearing you say is that we should just give away our genome data at least for the hospitals in Denmark, and that all of the data that we give away is just it's data about us, but it's not particularly the body. But biometric data is actually the body, and so what are your thoughts about using that for example, identification and logging into important systems?
The whole thing about logging into important systems, it's what kind of data do you want to use? I don't really know. I mean, I'm sure you can misuse any kind of method, whether it be biometric data or whatever. But the thing about the whole thing we have about biometric data and certainly genetic data nowadays, it's an odd mixture of being afraid to give these data away when, for example, a government database asks for it. But at the same time, they've just solved a crime in the US. They've just found a serial killer who, was working back in the 70s, because what they could do, they had an old DNA clue. They could go on these free databases where people punch in their data, their DNA data for ancestry. And this is something people go out there, it's recreational genomics, right? They go out and get a gene test, put it into a DNA, ancestry database where they can find people around the world that they're related to. It's something they pay for. They do it themselves. It's, accessible by the public. Suddenly, from using this kind of data, you can go in, check out all sorts of people, and find a serial killer from the 1970s. And I think there is already so much data out there of that kind that people have put out. They have not had any clue what it can be used for. I think that the train has sort of left the station when it comes to this. It's going to be, I think, a world where DNA data will be there. It will be almost impossible not to have your DNA data somewhere. So the question is, how do we get something in return? And we want to get something in return with respect to, for example, healthcare. Whether biometric data or even DNA data or something has to do with our physical body is a good way to access systems. It might be. And it might not be such a big worry if there's already a ton of DNA out there, for example. So it might be something that we will discuss now as, a little bit scary, but if it turns out that it has, great advantages, I think it will be used. But that's more of a technical question that I can't answer because I'm simply not experts like you guys are.
All right. So maybe getting back to your own PhD education. So you say it was a hard time. It was difficult. You were almost suffering through the 3 years, up and down and so on.
First year was hell, just hell.
Yeah, and then it improved, I guess.
It improved a little bit. Yeah. I got into purgatory.
So my question is, should we accept this kind of PhD education nowadays, or I mean, what?
I'm actually, in general, I'm all against, isolating people from every kind of difficulty, because it's not doing anyone a favor. I had been isolated very much from difficulty when I was at the University of Copenhagen. It was helping me out and everything was great. And I thought I was, much better at this than I was. It was very, very healthy to go through that kind of education. And I think it's something we should think about in general when we talk about education. Also just, basic education. It's really not a question of trying to help people through and have as easy a time as possible. It's about learning what you can do, how much you can do. And sometimes you need some resistance to find out what you can do. Of course, you don't need so much resistance that you break. So that's always a problem. But I think that isolating people and putting cotton around them is not a good idea. It's basically about what they can learn about themselves, how much they can do, and how much they can grow.
Thank you. So I don't see any more hands here, so I suggest we thank Lone again. Thank you very much for coming and sharing your story with us.